Hello, BookTube. I've got a modest Friday reads for you. This is the bare nub, the spine of what I'll probably be reading this weekend. Just some things that I've set aside that I don't think we've ever seen. I think that's the key theme that connects these particular books, and then there'll be others. Like, for instance, Austerlitz, which, good as my word, I told the young man at the Christian Science Model that when I found a copy, I would reread it with an open mind, and I did find a copy, so that's an example of one of the things that I'm not showing today. But I've got what do we have here? 6 things to show you that I'll be reading this weekend. The first one's a reread, but it's totally unexpected to me. It's a reissue of Papillon, the author's book about the man who escaped from Devil's Island. It was made into an incredibly famous movie starring Steve McQueen, and is apparently being made into a new movie starring Charlie Hunnam and the kid from Mr. Robot. So I guess I have no idea what that will be like. I think it's kind of rare to have a movie adaptation cover that is this attractive. So I like the design of it. It's fine. I don't have a copy of Papillon. I haven't read it in forever. When did it come out? When did Papillon first come out? Some of you probably know that. I'm not. 1970. I probably haven't read it since then. So we shall see. I don't have a screener for the movie, and I don't think that I'll be getting one, and I don't think I would watch it if I did, considering that the 2 stars are relatively talentless and enormous tobacco addicts, just freakishly. In fact, the sheer extent of it, the kid from Mr. Robot does nothing else. He doesn't eat or drink. He's a guild navigator. He lives on tobacco. And Charlie Hunnam is not far behind. It makes me wonder, well, I don't know. One way or another, I will ignore that in order to read the book and see what I make of it the second time around. And then the next one is part of an ongoing project for Penguin Books that is really, it's understated but remarkable. They're providing new translations of all of Georges Simenon's Maigret novels. All of them. And the latest one is this. It's Maigret's travels, where he goes to the French Riviera and solves a crime in his hangdog, methodical, undemonstrative way amongst the ultra-wealthy. And they're in these uniform white-spined editions that come out every month, and I have fallen into the habit of reading them and really enjoying the Maigret world more than I ever did when I read them originally. I read them originally, and some of you will remember those little white spine mass markets that all had a little picture of a policeman on the cover, a police detective on the cover. These are better designed, and last month it was Maigret Enjoys Himself, where he announces to his long-suffering wife that he's going to take a long vacation. He's not going to spend every single day until midnight at the police station. And with a clear conscience, no ulterior motive, he convinces his wife that rather than cram in with all the other vacationers and go somewhere, instead they would stay in Paris when everyone else is gone and enjoy all the things they used to do when they were penniless undergraduates. So they would walk the promenades and eat at a different restaurant every day and enjoy the papers and whatnot, and enjoy not having a city crammed full of people. That is the original plan in Maigret Enjoys Himself. But then a sensational murder takes place, and 2 doctors are suspects. And he's promised his doctor that he will take a vacation from police work, and he's promised his wife that he won't go back to the office until their vacation is over. So he decides to follow the crime as a citizen would follow it, as just an ordinary person, learning what they learned through the newspapers. And he gets more and more involved in it, and he starts sending anonymous notes to the police, nudging the investigation. And I read Maigret Enjoys Himself when I got the copy last month, and I just loved it. And I'm sure I'm going to love this too. For whatever reservations I had about this author 30 years ago, there was a time about 15, 20 years ago where suddenly people were starting to do long 5,000-word think pieces on how he's, the greatest thing since sliced bread, and he could teach Victor Hugo a thing or two. And things like that always bother me. But the books taken by themselves, a thorough pleasure. And what an amazing thing for Penguin to just, without any fanfare, redo the whole of the canon. That's just wonderful. So I'll be reading this. I'll be gobbling it down in about an hour. Then a big novel set in the Obama era America, which feels like 100 years ago. It's Seth Greenland, The Hazard of Good Fortune, which is with a rather nice cover. This is from Europa Editions. The title calls back The Hazard of Good Fortune by William Dean Howells, but I imagine the book won't. Nobody reads Howells anymore. But this is a story of a wealthy guy, a wealthy New Yorker who was also the owner of a basketball team, who, in a fit of pique, utters he himself is a perfectly well-adjusted, enlightened, non-racist guy, sort of a man of the people, even though he's enormously wealthy. And in a fit of pique, he utters a sentence that can be taken out of context to be intensely racist. And the book, I think, from what I read about it, is a commentary on how sensitive racially the society has become, to the point where no one around him, an overzealous policeman, an overzealous district attorney, no one is willing to read his comment in context. So this is sort of like a Bonfire of the Vanities, only updated for the present era, and it's big and it's ambitious, and I'm all for it. So I'll be reading that this weekend, and then fiction. So, problematic fiction. This is The Line That Held Us by David Joy. This is our author, and this is Appalachian fiction, what I call Hicklit. And the author's previous book did not sit well with me. I wrote a fairly brutal review of it. But I'm going to read this one. I've had the advanced copy, and I'm going to read, now that I have the finished copy, I'm just going to read it because, I don't know, can't quite put my finger on it. Something in that previous book, even though I hated it, something in it told me something. I don't know what it is. Ordinarily, if I find a fictional endeavor by an author just contemptuously manipulative or silly, both of which I would lay at the feet of that previous book, which was called here, if I'm going to talk about it, I want to mention what it is. Where All the Light Tends to Go, or The Weight of the World, The Weight of This World. It might have been one of the two. I didn't like either one of them. I didn't like his debut, and I didn't like the second book either. Even though that was true of both those things were true of that book, ordinarily, if those things are true of a book, I just dismiss it. I just say, all right, well, check back with the author in 20 years, but not the next book. And something about that book made me want to check out this one. So I'll be reading this once again. I will force myself to have a completely open mind. I will just go in it like I've never heard of the author before, and we'll see what happens. The next one is a debut. It's Cherry by Nico Walker. There is our author, and it I don't know if we've seen this. It's 2003. And as college freshmen in Cleveland, our narrator is adrift until he meets Emily. The two of them experience an instant, life-changing connection, but when he almost loses her, he chooses to make an indelible statement. He joins the army. The outcome will not be good for either of them. A medic in Iraq, he is unprepared for the realities that await him. He and his fellow soldiers huff computer duster, abuse painkillers, and watch porn. Many of them die. When he comes home, his post-traumatic stress disorder is profound. As the opioid crisis sweeps through the Midwest, it drags both him and Emily along with it. Hang on a second. There we go. As their addictions worsen, and with their money drying up, he stumbles onto what seems like the only possible solution: robbing banks. And you're going to be able to guess what I'm going to say coming from that description. The first time I read that description, I had the same reaction off camera that I always have on camera, which is none of that seems particularly believable. It all seems just a touch cartoonish. Although I'm sure that a lot of the first part of that maps onto the real experiences of plenty of Americans. Even so, it doesn't matter. It's a debut novel, and debut novels get a complete line of house credit with me, no matter what they sound like on the surface, because any one of them could blow me away. Any one of them could take the most trite or cartoonish or manipulative premise and just blow me away with it. Any one of them could. And that's the joy of a debut novel, is that you don't know what the author can do. You don't. I know, for instance, a lot of the things that this author can do. Now, in between the writing of his previous book and the writing of this one, he may have learned all sorts of new things. Those are the authors I love. It could be true. Or he could have refined the things that he did in his previous book so that they work better in this one. One way or another, there's an element that is missing from reading this that will be completely present reading this. That has an element of the unknown. And I love that. That's a thrill. And you only get that really in debut novels, because debut works of nonfiction are such intense committee procedures. The days when somebody could write a long, hefty history or biography with primary sources and archives consulted and all sorts of stuff like that without much in the way of institutional or personal support, I think those days are largely over. So even if you get a book on colonial New England that is the first book-length work the person has ever done, it's almost always an elaboration of their doctoral dissertation or the enlargement of an article or a series of talks or lectures to students. It's had a lot of vetting, whereas a debut novel can go straight from the author. It's possible, even with a major publisher, for it to go through fairly few rungs before it gets to the reader. It's possible for it to be fairly recognizable by the author as the book they wrote in their lonely garret while huffing paint cleaner or whatever. So we shall see. And then the next one's a work of history. It's The King's Assassin by Benjamin Woolley. And it is a study. It's the second study in, I think, 5 years. This one is thinner than the last one, of the possibility that King James I was murdered, that he was poisoned by his catamite favorite, George Villiers. And that theory was bruited, of course, in the day, because Villiers had very few friends at court. But then it was sort of buried. People just sort of dropped the idea that James had been murdered. They assumed that he died of disease or something like that. And recently, people have started looking at the contemporary records and whatnot and starting to think, might be worth investigating again, see whether or not Villiers actually went off his nut and killed his best friend and only benefactor. One way or another. This is right in Steve territory, so I'll be reading that. And that is the beginning of my Friday reads. These are, you notice half of these are very thin. They won't take me very long at all. Half of these will be done by morning. But it's the beginning, because I will probably add lots of stuff to this. I want to read Austerlitz. I'll probably read a large chunk of Virginia Woolf's diaries. I got a one-volume abridgment of Virginia Woolf's diaries, and they're addictive. Once you start, I'll probably end up reading a huge chunk of that book. And you never know what else. You never know what else will... I'm leaving room, in other words, for other things. But in the meantime, this is it. We have history, The King's Assassin. We have a debut work of fiction, Cherry by Nico Walker. We have The Line That Held Us by David Joy. We have The Hazards of Good Fortune by Seth Greenman. We have Papillon. And we have Maigret's Travels. The latest in the Inspector Maigret translation project being done by Penguin. So that's my Friday reads at the beginning, anyway. And I'll be eagerly watching all of your Friday reads. They're one of my favorite BookTube staples. But in the meantime, I'll wrap this up, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.